So I'm landing for this whistle stop time to think about us and our personal and professional sustainability. You may feel like you've got a huge amount of ballast on board, that you're really stable, that you're not wobbling at all, in which case maybe just use this hour as a bit of investment, a bit of kind of prophylaxis for the winter, or think about some of the things that I mentioned as regards your team and impact on team. Basically, as celebrating professionals, it's good to take times like this to inform ourselves. So firstly, of the opposition, of the threat. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about burnout because I have talked on a couple of occasions before, but just a whistle stop through that, because I think being aware of signs to look for in ourselves and in others is actually part of the empowerment. And then I'm going to look at attributes of the resilient self. And what hits home, take home, incorporate it, sit back and just reflect on yourself and those around you. And then really what I've learned through the last couple of years, 2-3 years, I've just drawn some tools and tips and strategies together, specifically for clinicians really, because there's a whole lot out there which I myself have found somewhat difficult to swallow. And so I've tried to kind of gather up those practical things that are useful. This is where I'd like to start. Cambridge School of Clinical Medicine. It looks like 1887. It's actually 1987, and that's me there. And this is my cohort. I don't know if you recognise some radiologists there, bottom right-hand corner, the lovely Dr. Justin Cross, and Nick Carroll above him, and then there's the wonderful Paul Flynn in the middle. We were house officers with Prof. Tim Cox's firm together, and then there's Julian Owen, obviously. Bottom left is one of the other GPs in my team, Paula Newton. So that's where I started at the clinical school, trained in general practice, moved out into general practice for about 20 years. And then around 7 years ago, came back into Addenbrooke's as part of the chaplaincy, not an ordained chaplain, but working with the chaplaincy, thinking that I would be with the population of patients, but very quickly became aware of the other population under pressure, and it was the clinicians. And so I got drawn into starting debrief groups, which Fiona alluded to. You may recognise some of your colleagues here. Started in oncology, moved to neurology, physiotherapy, and then radiology. TC invited me in to actually do debrief groups across the whole consultant and registrar body 2019, before COVID hit. And we looked at various things. There was a very important cake fest at the end of every month, and lots of good conversations happened over that. And then there were some quite animated debrief groups going on. Ashley Shaw asked me to gather together in a scientific fashion the results of that, and I was able to publish both in the clinical radiology and the BMJ. And then COVID came and started to expose all the vulnerabilities that we were already aware of. And it seemed a fairly intuitive and rather rapid evolution for me to upskill and increase the action. So lots more debrief groups taking place, going virtual, but spread across the whole of the physiotherapy service, the occupational health physicians, some radiology nurses, the palliative trainees. And then the other thing that happened was just an increase in request for one-to-one support. So I gathered together 3 colleagues, very experienced pastoral GP colleagues, and we formed the Doctors-for-Doctors team. Just present or as sounding boards, as a really off-the-record, easily accessed, I think I'm not doing very well, or I'm beginning to not do well, I need someone to talk to. That's the forum that we presented. And we started off, I suppose I had about 6 folks in conversation at the beginning of COVID. I must just say at this point I had stepped out of chaplaincy, and Alison Risker from Medical Workforce, thankfully on TC's recommendation, had just said just create a consultant role for professional wellbeing and clinician support, because I kind of outgrown the capacity of chaplaincy for that. So it was under all 4 of us GPs joined us on the staff bank to support our peers, and very quickly requests came in. You may be aware of a regular, I suppose, 6-weekly email from me via medical staffing, basically saying, please come and talk if you need to. And we now have, what's the last count, 216 of your peers. So I suppose about 10% of the workforce, medical workforce, now in one-to-one pastoral conversation. I thought to call it a pastoral supervision, but quite recently some folks have said, oh, that scared me off because I thought it was going to be written down and I was being monitored. Actually, it's, as I said, off the record, support, a sounding board, a reflection space. And actually, by word of mouth, we are seeing 1 in 8 of the CUH consultants, 1 in 6 specialty leads, a number of the senior medical fraternity, and mainly really consultants and senior trainees. And there's a little bit more of the demographic here. Delightfully, there is now huge bi-directional flow with occupational health, staff mental health, NHS practitioner health and GPs. So I suppose maybe we've had about 6 folks actively suicidal coming to us, and we just liaised with our colleagues, obviously totally consensually with our colleague in distress. And as I say, we're now being referred folks from those services. So I don't apologise for just describing this, because I think it's helpful to know what's grassroots available for yourselves, for you. One of the key features of what I try and do is that, so I'm the recipient of requests, and I try and turn things around really quickly and respond to people within a few hours, and then we see people generally within a week. And if it's any more than that, it's because you're not free. So if I'm not free to see you, then I'll ask one of my colleagues, and we'll see folks, I suppose, from about 7:30 in the morning through to Paula particularly will see people evenings and weekends. So if you need to speak, if you can't find a daytime, it'll be evenings and weekends. What, you ask, do people talk about? What are the presenting or emerging issues that colour our conversations? Well, yes, they are generally work-related issues initially, but there's also a lot of home stuff. Put into a word frequency diagram, like the kind of stuff that we talk about. Notably, there's a lot of COVID-related pressures, particularly at the moment, colleague struggles, interpersonal unhappiness, team dysfunction, upset with management. And then as the whole, there's this wash of uncertainty over everything still. There's very much the generation of stress, anxiety, precipitation of burnout, and then there's this sense of, do I want to stay in this job? You know, career direction, and then what am I here for? What's my life about? So a whole load of stuff comes up to do with work. And then home pressures, well, caring for elderly relatives during the pandemic, having a baby during lockdown, so the lockdown childcare issues, the struggling teenagers. A number of your peers, and you'll be aware of it, have teenagers who have not done well in the environment of COVID in our society, in our schools, in our universities. And so that's a huge challenge for us as jobbing clinicians to carry on holding that. And then obviously there's deaths near and far. And just I've become aware over the last 18 months of meeting one-to-one with people how many international folks we have amongst us. They predominate over those who are whose family are totally in England. So just a lot of issues coming up in that respect. And then the symptomatology, as you would expect, diverse. I think we've found it helpful being GPs, because it means that anyone from any specialty can come with anything. And we generally have got some kind of handle on things. So what do? We encourage, we capture, we encourage, I suppose, self-agency. So I very much feel like I'm holding a mirror up to you and our peers, basically asking questions, just enabling people to find answers, and then advising and signposting wherever's helpful. It's gratifying that 2/3 of people come back for more. For a number of people, they'll come once, and that really helps to kind of right the boat, and then maybe 6 months later write again. So a number of ICU doctors writing now, just saying, I'm not sure that I can continue now. Thank you for seeing me back in the spring. Can we meet again? And maybe we can walk together through the winter. So a lot of people now, we're in one-to-one, a good old-fashioned general practice. You know, you walk alongside people as they work with their stuff. And I think, interestingly, the leaders amongst the consultant bodies are finding it quite helpful to keep home boat afloat, their own lives afloat, self-care wise, but also strategically for teams, being able to just reflect together about, what's the way forward leading my team through these difficult times. You've probably absorbed everything on this slide as I've been talking. And then these are just the constellation of things that we talk about, some tools, some concepts. So I always try and kind of leave a deposit of something for people to think about, to be encouraged by, to take away. And we'll look at some of these. In fact, a lot of these concepts have informed the rest of the 45 minutes we have together. So let's start. Let's think about the pressures and potholes. Just very quickly, before we even enter hospital, we are surrounded by a hurrying population, a hurrying society. No more needs to be said, but finding a place of rest currently in 2021 with the light bulb, the computer, the internet, the social media is actually quite hard and puts a stress on us. Then we enter the NHS, which I would point us to the right-hand side, and we find a culture of lack of a number of things, obviously resources. In the 11,000 staff of CUH, quite often identity, connectivity, and then with the pressures of burnout pre-COVID and now COVID, the first thing that goes is thanks, appreciation, honour, encouragement, and we start talking in difficult ways to each other. It's been reported nationally that burnout levels are high. And what about in CUH? I've presented this data before, that similar levels of burnout when surveying consultants and registrars. What is burnout? So let's just think about the 3 dimensions. There's depletion of our emotions, mental function and physical, I would say, and then a feeling of withdrawing and then disengaging professionally. I'll let you cast your eyes down the symptomatology. And then I'd like to introduce you to others in the brotherhood of the burnout beasts. So with COVID, we've seen, and I've met a lot of folks now presenting with trauma exposure response, that inner change that happens when you are marinading in dying COVID patients. And I'm wondering whether, indirectly and possibly directly, you've suffered the same. And there's the PTSD, and it drove me to actually look up the little clusters of symptomatology, and I'm just going to share them very quickly with you with few words actually. There's the reliving of memories, either a memory of something either daytime or nighttime. There's our hyperarousal. There's our then wanting to avoid thinking about these things, and we start cutting ourselves off and compensating. And then this is the deeply erosive thing where nowhere becomes safe. You find yourself becoming very mistrustful, and then a bit autoimmune disease, like you turn in on yourself and it's all your fault, and there's guilt and there's shame. Interestingly, 2/3 of folks suffering from PTSD don't present, and there is a spectrum. So you may have some of these, but not actually have the full-blown PTSD. So I'm just, rather than depressing you, I'm hoping to empower you with just the knowledge of what's in the water at the moment. Finally, we might feel we're familiar with anxiety and depression, but again, just doing a bit of a self-check. I was spending some time with some clinical fellows and SAS doctors yesterday, and one of them said, I've got all of these, but I've just got used to it. And I would say that's kind of not okay to get used to being like this, because it needn't be a steady state. And my challenge is when anxiety goes from being a facilitating energizer to washing the whole of your life, where you wake in the night ruminating over the daytime, ruminating over the number of unreported scans. That's a very basic pleb's eye view of some of the pressures that you have. Then that's not okay, and and it's worth having a conversation with somebody. So I'm thinking there are all these different syndromes, but basically what do they have in common? What can we look out for? And this is a very simplistic slide that I produce when I've been doing work enabling physios for physios, a pastoral kind of system generating within the physio department. And basically it's kind of asking yourself, am I my normal self? Are my rhythms changing? Am I becoming more brash, more agitated? Am I starting to lose my temper? If not at work, then at home. Usually it's home first, work second. Or am I very quiet, but I'm withdrawing and becoming quieter, removing myself from the center of attention? Am I sleeping really badly? Or am I sleeping more? Do I just get home and go to bed after I've checked Epic and done all this and that? Obviously eating more, eating less, and then there's the big golden eggs that are obvious, which are bursting into tears more and feeling low. So I present you with those oppositional threats and the things to look out for, and then I'd like to think about you. So I'd just like to ask you, pull your reflective hat firmly on your head, stand fair and square in your shoes. Let me find the right page on my notes just so that I speak really well, and let's think about us and the attributes of self and what actually is resilience. And I'm a simple lass, so I'm thinking it's bounce, it's the bounce back, it's the spring back into shape. And if it is bounce, then how do I retain this? Or how do I regain it if I feel I'm losing it? How do I safeguard and hold on to my health? And is it just down to me to do this? I think any talking about resilience and tips and tools would be inadequate if I didn't say that it's really important that our management, our organisational structure is mindful. And there was a great Levy and Levy article in Clinical Radiology about 2.5 years ago looking at organisational mindfulness. And I just point you to a fantastic study in the Mayo Clinic where they made 9 organisational changes and reduced the burnout of the whole of their medical fraternity by 1/3. So it's not just down to us. It's not fair to point the finger at the individual. I agree. Let's be individuals and think about our perfectly resilient role model and look at attributes of self. Number 1, before I do anything, I need to get to know myself. I need to know myself. Maybe you are all highly reflective individuals. You're aware of when you're well, you're aware of when you're not doing well, you understand yourself. But there are many of us who rush from one need to the next, whether it's needs at home, needs at work. Don't stop to ask, how am I intentionally? You know, how am I sleeping? How is my thought life? How close am I to my nearest and dearest? Have I attended to my relationships? How much weight have I put on over lockdown? Am I still exercising? Do I know what exercise I like? Do I do it? Am I crying more? All of these questions, it's so obvious that we just don't do them. But now is the time where we cannot afford to not every now and then stop and, you know, check the oil. Check the oil, put the litmus paper in our environment and see if it's bright red or if it's dark blue, or is it neutral? Am I doing okay? So these are good questions, and I ask them in every debrief group. You know, do you know your signs of impending avalanche? You know, do you get quieter? Do you start controlling, making lists? Do you become impossible at home? Do you suddenly start waking at 3 a.m. and not getting back to sleep? Are you irritable with the kids? One of the NICU doctors said, my wife tells me as my humour gets darker and darker and I become more cynical and sarcastic, that's when she knows I need to take my foot off the gas and take some time out. So you need to know what happens to you, and it's always helpful to have someone else who you trust to say, you know, could you keep an eye? Would you notice? Just tell me when you see that I'm becoming not my normal self. And then it's important to know what does us good, what revives us, what are our wants, needs, and must-haves. Again, you kind of look at this and think, oh yeah, it's obvious. But do you know? And if you do know, do you do it? So for me, I know hot bath at the end of the day, bit of time before I start talking to anyone at the beginning of the day, to reflect, to take time, to read my Bible, to get out in the fresh air, to get some sun on my face, all those things. And or are they the first things that go when you're in a rush, and then you become less effective and less able and full to do what you need to do? I leave you. This evening is a load of questions to you. So see what your answers might be. So Dr. Resilient looks after him and herself, knows about him and herself, and supports. So what's this about? Well, I don't know about you, but as a a natural perfectionist, a driving achiever who has grown up taking exams every 6 months for at least 10 to 15 years, quite often our internal dialogue is very negative. And my question myself and to you this evening, would you ever talk to an acquaintance, let alone a good friend, the way you talk to yourself? So sometimes I find myself saying, oh, that was really rubbish. I did so badly that I need to stop doing this because I'm hopeless. How often say, oh, that was hopeless? Sometimes we just speak it over ourselves. You say, oh, I don't pay any attention to that. But you know, when we're in an environment where everything is tough, then actually being your best encourager when no one else around you is encouraging you, I find it deeply nourishing. We look at take a quick look at personality types. There are some of us that need a lot of encouragement and some who need less, but you need to know yourself in that. My other challenge is how many people listening this evening are sorry people, so who punctuate pretty much everything they say, every encounter, with an initial or sorry to bother you, or sorry, I wonder if I could just ask this, or sorry for keeping you waiting. And I was challenged one day to replace every sorry with a thank you, unless I needed to apologize for something. So the clinic's running behind, or you're behind on reporting, or you're behind on helping someone, rather than sorry to keep you waiting, you maintain your poise and the volume of yourself by saying thank you for waiting. Instead of sorry to bother you, is, you know, thank you for taking time, could you just explain X or Y? Or rather than sorry to change the plans, it's thank you for bearing with me. And you'll notice, I think the evolutionary reason we say sorry is we diminish ourselves so that we're a smaller target to get thwacked. But actually, as leaders, and we're all leaders, we need to maintain our self and our poise and our authority. I would really challenge you to try and change from a sorry to a thanks for bearing with me, thank you for helping me, thanks for waiting, and really and take sorries out of your email, and lots of thanks. People love it when you thank them anyway. Clinical psychologists tell us that as we speak and behave, we really affect how we think and feel. This is self-explanatory, but so you can see if you're constantly apologizing for your existence, your sense of self-agency diminishes. Which brings me on to another attribute of our perfectly resilient role model, self-responsibility. So I'm talking about whether we're a victim of circumstance or whether we feel that we have an internal locus of control. We are very self-agent people. We choose our language to reflect a sense of taking control over every situation. So you may be swamped with a huge amount of demand. Everything feels out of control. You can either turn belly up and say, oh, this is always happens and it's everybody else's fault and you just have to do this and we just have to get on. Or you say, in spite of this feeling of catastrophe and there's lots going on, I'm going to choose to start here, then I'm going to be doing this, and then I'll try and meet every demand, but this is my plan. So you take the control back. And again, it may sound a little bit airy-fairy, but I wonder where your locus of control is. Even in the direst of circumstances, you can choose and speak in the first person, and that's really helpful. Which brings me on to the circle of influence. I'm keeping an eye on the time. This is a really helpful concept, I think, through COVID particularly. You're that little stick person in the middle. It's really helpful to know those things in your life and your work and at home that you can control, those things that you can't control but you've got some influence over, and invest your time and attention in those things. The rest on the outside that upsets you, concerns you, affects you, but you can't do anything about, I would suggest you start to cut out of your life, cut out of your attention. So I'm thinking, for me, instead of going on the BBC News app 10 times a day to see what's happening, checking up on the COVID worldometer of blah, 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 can't do anything about it. Once a day is enough. And then I just keep that attention and that emotional reserve for what I can change. And I think about one small step that I can take. It's energy conservation. My next challenge to you is, are you a yes person? You like to please, you like to look after other people, you like to say yes to everything. And you find yourself getting loaded and loaded and loaded. Here are 6 different ways of not saying yes. Some of us on this call will be quite happy to confront with the direct, no, I won't be doing that for you. And some people are happy to say, I won't because, so that's the reasoned no. I would recommend thoroughly the delayed no, which is, thanks for asking, can I come back to you? How easy is that? So I was asked by one of your colleagues, could I present at the BIR? This was last year, because I've learned this lesson now. I said, yes. I didn't ask the date. I didn't ask how long I was presenting. I didn't look at what else was happening in my diary around the time. And I went home, had a look and thought, oh my goodness, how am I going to get a time to prepare it, put it on the BIR template slides? I think I probably would have still said yes, but I would have been a bit more powerful about it. So the delayed no is really good. And then you can come back and you can use the inquiring, you know, I'm afraid I won't be able to help you, but tell me more about it. Is there another option? Is there another way of solving this? And then you maybe offer an alternative solution. Or perhaps say, I can't do this for you, but if I did that, that would free you up to do this. So there are so many other ways than just saying yes to everything and getting completely snowed under. Self-identity. So it is powerful as Dr. Resilient to have a sense of who you are. Give time to develop your inner life, and to the effect there's a kind of coherence about you, and you work with meaning and purpose. You seek and set your own moral compass. You ask the big questions of life. And I really emphasize this as having spent time as a chaplain and met with so many people ill, old, infirm, first time in a hospital bed, who haven't had the time to sit down and ask the questions of, why am I here? What did I want to do with my life? You know, those bigger ones. Is there a God? If there is, how do I know? You know, the truth will out. Am I going to search it? Am I going to give any time to have conversation with anybody or think about this? There's the sense of the light aircraft. If you know that you've set your compass or you set your sat nav somewhere, however much you get blown off course by your illness, family illness, difficulties at work, you know where you're going. And I would just encourage us, as Maslow did, to think about the needs, our needs as humans. In the 1940s, he did a lot of studies of populations, and he brought this Maslow's hierarchy of human need. 30 years later, he publishes again and says, I forgot. I didn't know, I didn't notice, but there's a part in every one of us that is really looking for our meaning beyond ourselves. And this resonates with, there's a part in a biblical literature that says God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. So there's this jigsaw-sized piece that if we ignore it, that there'll come a time when we want to look at it. But I would encourage us as relatively young folks to do what they do in other parts of the non-Western world, which is actually, it's conversation over the table. It's time for reading and thinking and chatting. I'll leave that one with you and move on to Resilient understands their core behavioral expressive type. And I would just like to say that, you know, if we understand what we're good at in our communication style, and then how other people speak, which is different from ourselves, then we can learn to speak other people's language, and that's really helpful, I think, particularly in the climate of today, where there's a lot of difficulty and stress. So I have no shares in this particular tool. It's much more simple than Myers-Briggs 16 personality types, profiles, attributes, and it looks at 4 dimensions of behavior and attributes of color. How easy is that? And it's quite a good jobbing way of looking and thinking about your colleagues. So it looks at 4 dimensions: the red dimension, the yellow. So the red is how we approach problem and challenge. Yellow is how we influence people. Green is what time we take over relationships, and blue is how we look at procedure and protocol and data. I'm just going to take you for a quick tour through very small 1% of the population who are completely one colour. Most of us have a little palette of them. So let's just look at the red. Have a think about yourself and have a think about your colleagues, maybe those who trip you up or who annoy you or who you get sparring with. This is the high red. On a good day, they're decisive, they're the bish bash bosh. This is what we need to do, this is where we're going, these are the options, let's take this one and let's do it at this time. They can come over bullying and blunt. They're the ones who kind of, like Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, they'll lead you into the war and they'll get you through it. But they're quite like Marmite, you either love them or hate them, and you can get quite a lot of confrontational behavior in high reds. But if you want to communicate with one, you cannot go with an airy fairy bit of waffle. I'm not feeling great about this issue, but I don't really know what I want to happen. That will infuriate a red. You want to go having a logical, thought out A, B, C, D, and then present some options and let them take their choice. The high yellow is that the artist, the musician, the comedian, charming, walk into a room, they light up the room. If they're sad, everybody knows it. They can be a bit chaotic and impulsive, a little bit glib, quite over talkative at times. Hand gestures really matters. The big picture, the blue sky thinking, the visionary, the storytelling. It matters that they are appreciated and encouraged. Friendships matter, freedom from detail and clutter, but the big picture really matters. So communicating with a yellow, you don't really want to bish bash bosh, you want to actually inquire, what are their thoughts, what's their experience, where do they feel we should be going big picture wise, and not clutter them up with a whole load of data and facts. So this is just a really, really broad brush stroke. I wonder if we've got any blues. I think we've got quite a lot of blues here. These are your analysts, your researchers, your accountants, your engineers. These are the folks who are precise and analytical. Data matters, facts matter, the what ifs matter, the trial runs matter. Lots going on in the hard disk, not much expressed out until you've come to a conclusion. So a stressed blue can look actually quite unfriendly and not talk much. And you can take them completely the wrong way. They don't like me. They don't like me. So I'm married to a high blue, and sometimes I just look at him and I think, so I say, Paul, could you put some words around what you're thinking? Because I feel like I've upset you. He's a lighting engineer. He said, I'm just working out what DMX connections I need at the gig on Saturday at the Corn Exchange. And I'm thinking, that I haven't upset you. Just some words would have been helpful. So if you have colleagues who don't use many words but are working stuff out, it's sometimes just really helpful to learn, what kind of language do I need to use? So for me, I sit on my hands, I slow down. There's so much thought process going on in a blue. Don't clutter it with words. Speak slowly and steadily, logically. Oh God, help me to speak logically, and allow time. And don't ask a blue to break the rules without huge substantial evidence of it. So I hope you get the idea of the blue. Let me finally introduce the green. NHS is full of amazing greens. These are people who take time to listen, who are empathetic and patient. They're team players. It really matters to a green that they are loyal and faithful, and they care intensely about the team, about the patients and their relatives, about how everybody in the room is. How is everybody around this MDT table before we kick off? They're the ones who, again, take time. So the blues and greens take time. The yellows and reds are like, let's go. The blues and greens need that time, and the green can be seen to be a little bit slow, a bit hesitant, a bit stubborn, a bit possessive, and again, non-demonstrative, because the green is thinking about everyone else, hasn't really worked out whether they actually want to say yes to something, so generally say yes and maybe regret it afterwards, can stay in relationships a bit too long. Your greens won't tell you what they feel. So if you have someone who's actually a high green and you don't ask them to voice their opinions, you might find 2 months down the line they've resigned and you didn't know anything about it, because they're thinking about everyone else all the time and not voicing themselves. So if you've got those kind of folks, these are the folks who man the vaccination centres, who support everybody. You need to show that you care. So you start your meeting, you might be a high red and think, we've got so much to get through, we've got 70 scans to get through. Just starting with a statement of, wonder how everyone is today, really aware we're under pressure, shall we get going? The greens go, oh, that's nice. I'm with you. I'll follow you all the way. So showing that you care, talking calmly, just not pushing people too fast. So greens will find multitasking quite stressful. They can do it, but it's stressful. And it's, again, as a team lead, worth knowing that one thing at a time is easier for a green. Let me just give you a fun example. It sounds like a joke. Red, blue, green and yellow are going on holiday. They come to the airport, the checkout desk. There's a massive long queue all the way around. I was going to say outpatients, but the check-in lounge. And what does the red do? The red marches past everyone else in the queue to the checkout desk, says, what's going on? What's the status? What are you doing about it? And when is the projected time that we get through? And just takes control. The green is clucking around finding a chair for the elderly person who's looking a bit wobbly, making sure there's enough water for folks, just checking that everyone's doing okay. Pregnant ladies, sit down. The yellow, well, the yellow hasn't really even noticed because she's so enjoying, or he's so enjoying meeting all these new people. There's so many interesting stories. And have you met that chap back there? Because he's doing research on this and he's told me about ... So the yellow's having a great time. Where's the blue? The blue is nowhere to be found because they've gone online a few hours earlier, found that there was a lot of congestion in the airport, left early, went straight through, is in the departure lounge reading a scientific journal. So that's just a humorous way of thinking about who's in your team, who's around the MDT table, and being aware that as you can see, the outgoing reds, yellows are going to be moving quickly. Perhaps the blues and greens are taking a bit more time. If you're high blue, red, you're quite task focused, but the yellows, greens are kind of people oriented. So just aware of those in your team. So Dr. Resilient knows how to handle people. And if anyone wants to meet up, we can do a personal profile of DISC, and it might be helpful for teams. If you're struggling in your team, I'm working with a number of teams across the hospital, and everybody does a profile, and then we discuss and we talk about things, and it's absolutely brilliant for teamwork. Recommend it. So connectedness, Dr. Resilient knows that they need to be connected at home and at work. So a particular study I looked at, people identified the emotionally available other as being a huge part of their resilient self. And then at work, how many course after course after course of juniors say it changes my whole day when a senior gives me a piece of encouragement or a piece of feedback, or just takes a minute to ask how I feel it's going. And you're not going to open a floodgate necessarily just by thanking, appreciating, honouring, giving guidance. That was okay, but it'd be better like this. And then obviously with consultant colleagues, just sharing our vulnerabilities, or certainly encouragement and support. Really important, because we aren't going to stay resilient doing this isolated. And I know there's lots of home working and we can be quite isolated, but we need to find resilience between ourselves. But this is Dr. Resilient. I'm aware we've got a quarter of an hour left. I wondered if I could share just a few quick tips and tools. So inside the toolbox. So I'm going to take the liberty of moving on. And we've talked about tools and strategies, things at home, knowing your fillers and revivers. I would really encourage you. The number of doctors I've spoken to, they say, well, I don't really do anything else. I just work. Just like that may be okay now, but that might not be okay in the future. As you go through, you're going to deplete, your battery is going to run down. I think we all need to be aware of the work of Mr. Peter Brennan, ENT surgeon in Southampton. He's done a lot of publishing with the aviation industry, looking at the effects of dehydration on our cognitive function, the effect of the loss of sleep on our risk-taking behaviour, the effect of anger on our surgical mistakes. And so just being aware of how you are, trying to take control of that, the multitasking, and try and unitask within the multitasking. So you're interrupted, make a note, now I'm on this task, because I think about 4 or 5 of our cognitive attributes really depleted when we're multitasking and we're not aware of trying to compartmentalize within that. I know it's a counsel of perfection, I know. And then we could have a whole session on the effect of encouragement, respect, kindness, the power of the sorry, all of these things. I risk sounding condescending, but I think, again, the literature, since about 2013, there has been an explosion in literature showing that team performance is dramatically reduced and your cognitive bandwidth in making decisions massively reduced with mild to moderate rudeness. And I'm not talking shouting or cutting remarks. I'm talking lack of thanks, lack of appreciation. That kind of stuff really affects how we perform and how resilient we are. Then this is a real chestnut, I'm aware, with a number of you who have home workstations, but somehow we need to delineate home from work. So whether it's having a workstation in a different room, if folks are like me, we don't have that capacity in our house. So I have to do really simple things like stuff goes under the table when I've stopped working. And I say, right, I'm finishing now. And I just try and have these just little rituals or cues that tell me this room now, where we eat, watch telly, entertain, has gone from being my home space to my workspace where I do debriefs and virtual stuff, and now it's changed back again, and really, really degrading to your ability to stay well. The going home checklist, I guess we have to adapt to your situation, but I'm particularly taken with this metaphor which I share with you, and it's about taking off all the emotional stuff, the emotional transference, the coats, the wet coats, the heavy, the difficult conversation with a colleague, the upset relative, the constant interruptions. They get hung on our emotional coat stand, and at the end of the day, if we can, rather than take it all home or into a different part of our home, just in your head think, okay, I need to leave, I need to take this stuff off, I need to get rid of this heavy stuff. It's not all mine, it's other people's. In a similar way, you might feel at the end of your working day, I've been pulled through a hedge backwards, I've got all these burrs, it's all other people's stuff, I'm going to brush off, I am home now. It can sound trite, but it's actually a really powerful way of self-managing and self-caring. It's delineating home from work and marking the boundary, and I'd really encourage you to think about that and bear it in mind. I'm coming into the home straight, the nuts and bolts. I'd like to just very briefly share a few remaining tools that are quite helpful to think about, and some of you might have heard me talk about these before. I was introduced to the 3 chairs by our past chaplain. He said the middle chair is the chair of the present, left chair, chair of the past, right chair, chair of the future. And my question is, which chair do you spend most time in? Do you linger in the chair of the past, reliving those angry conversations, those difficult encounters, the regrets, the lows, the highs? Do you just constantly think about those past holidays, which is helpful to start off with, but then you just get this sense of pining and longing? Are you drawn back to ruminate over past failures and bad decisions, turning them over and over in your mind? Or, alternatively, do you hover in the chair of the future, worrying about what's to come, lost in the lists, the plans, the pathways ahead, planning and fretting and wondering what will happen, your mind tangled up in the what-ifs of tomorrow, later today, next week, next month, next year, the next exam? Are you hovering in that chair of the future? Also, not a very good place to stay. How much time do you fair and square put your backside in the middle chair, where you're actually present in the here and now, the breath you're breathing, the way you're feeling and thinking, the consciousness of yourself, your body, your emotions, your thoughts? If that's a bit wooey, maybe are you present with your family, with the child doing homework, their questions? My paramedic son, when he was younger, said, "Mum, you're here, but you're not really here." I thought, it's true. I was working out what to say next week. Are you enjoying the food you eat? Do you spend long eating? Do you enjoy the shower, or is it literally wash and go? Are you relaxing in the here and now? There are good things and essential professional things we need to do in the chair of the past and the future, but actually we were created to spend most time in the here and now. So I leave that one with you. What other tools? Top right, let it be, let it go, let it in. This was something I heard in a Resilience Day that was useful, and I was pointed to this excellent book by Prof. Steve Peters. It looks at the response of the human to threat, and he basically uses a simplistic form of a game of two teams. There's our primitive limbic, this looks slightly rude, apologies, fight, flight, fright or freeze response, which kicks in 5 or 6 times quicker to an assault, to a threat. And we know it, don't we? That sense of anxiety, that sense of overwhelm, that sense of tachycardia, that sense of slight breathlessness. You know, I've had 10 bleeps in the last 5 minutes. I've got to re-triage my list and I've just frozen. And then the other team is our rational, humane cerebral cortex, the kind of frontoparietal, just that, you know, a bit of a lazy kicking in, catches up a bit later. And so the phrase and the picture, I chose this picture of a bath, imagining yourself as a bath. The phrase, which you can use, it takes few seconds only. So unless someone needs CPR in front of you, you've got time to do this if you feel in a state of overwhelm. Let it be means, okay, acknowledge it. My bath is full of this chaotic place. My head is full of it. You lean forward, you in your head take out the bath plug and you let it go. And you watch, it's a sensate thing. You're just like, okay, I'm just going to let that anxiety go. And then what do you let in? You let in remembering. You remember you can do this, you've done it before. Or if you haven't done it before, you've done something similar. You are able to do this. You remember the wonderful things that you've enjoyed. You remember the people who love you. You remember the past events, things that make you feel good. So you fill up your bath with goodness, and then you're ready. So you're feeling more confident, your brain's had time to catch up in its full cerebrating capacity, and it's kind of a restorative pause. And I would recommend it. It's like a micro restorative pause, and it's a powerful tool as a professional in a broken system, because a broken system will present you with a lot of threat. And if you can be constantly functioning in the best form of yourself, both teams on board, you will do well and you'll be sustainable. The clinical psychologists talk about a slightly longer restorative pause where you engage your breathing. So there's the kind of involving your parasympathetics with a kind of elongated, held inspiration and then expiration. Studies have shown that you can reduce your blood pressure and your basic kind of sinus rate by doing that. And then there's the kind of power stances, the open postures. You know, when you're in a really difficult MDT or whatever, if we're sitting with our legs crossed and kind of making ourselves smaller, testosterone levels fall, cortisol rises, oxytocin affected. You know, actually the way that we hold ourselves, management consultant firms send their trainees before they're presenting to a large room of people, says, go into the loo and stand with your arms open, hands on hips, you know, the power poise, because then you're engaging your physiology to do well. So I leave these extraordinary things with you if you're still listening and haven't signed off. And the last thing I want to leave with you as regards tips and tools is the 8 Ps. This is like my homegrown CBT, and it's if you're faced with a challenge or difficulty or a kind of, oh, this is a disastrous situation, I've had the most terrible conversation with my educational supervisor, what do I do? Ask yourself one or some of these questions. How bad is it on a scale of 1 to 10? Will it last forever? And then that kind of, I always get, oh, this happens to me. Does it only happen to you? And is it really your fault? Or are there other players? Come on, take the pressure off. Just think a little bit objectively. If you're a very positive person, what can I learn from this? And 3 ways it could be worse. This is the one I use a lot and I would recommend. Face every eventuality. What's the worst that can happen? What's the best that can happen? What's the most likely thing that can happen? Okay, I've faced everything. I can go back and face the music. That's a useful one. Then there's Thomas Edison, who says, I've learned what I can't do. I'll try again. And then I just recommend what small step, when you're faced with a complex situation, break it down. And just like this Charles McKenzie picture with the boy in the wood, can't see where he's going. The wise horse says, can you see the footstep in front of you, the step in front of you? The boy says, yes. the horse says, just take that. And the number of things and problems that have been solved by just the next step. So useful. I leave you with a few things. This is just some feedback we've had on the one-to-ones of Doctors for Doctors, and my take-home message is, please start listening. If you haven't already, start listening to those distress flares in yourself, distress signals, and just come and talk about it. It's all off the record, and it's really helpful. I think people are finding it helpful. And then I finally just leave you, and I can very definitely share this PDF, a PDF of this. There are many places you can go to locally to get help, not just Doctors for Doctors. Some of them go on records, others don't. I quite often use these sources. And then there's, for a number of the consultants, they've said to me, I don't want to do anything local, I need national help. I would recommend NHS Practitioner Health in the centre there, fabulous, quite accessible. And then there's some apps and podcasts, and I would, if you're a podcast person, I would really recommend this very professional You Are Not a Frog, which implies, you know, just because you're in a saucepan of boiling water, you don't need to jump out. There are some strategies that help you to stay afloat. Really good. Rachel Morris is fantastic. So I leave this with you, and thank you. And I think I've left 3 minutes. Any reflections or questions? Thank you for listening. I'm going to stop screen sharing now.